A point of focus for you as of late has been the Holodomor, namely the modern day denial of it, as well as Stalin's original attempts to cover it up. For context, this was a horrible man-made famine in Ukraine back in the early 1930s during the Soviet Union's first five-year plan. Now, at the very least, 3 million Ukrainians died, and it could have very well been as many as 5 million. But like I was saying, this famine was man-made in that it was the direct result of Stalin's policies. His farm collectivization plan at the time was failing, and because of this, there was a strong Ukrainian independence movement that sought to separate from the Soviet Union. And naturally, Stalin didn't like this, so the state seized whichever little food was produced, and from there they sealed the country's borders so that no Ukrainians could.
Yeah, what it pretty much was on that. First off, it kind of, the most accepted number is about 3.9 million, but yeah, it's debated between 3 to 5 million, but most will say 3.9 million. I just round that to 4 million. What it's probably the best way to describe it is that it's a man-made famine or disaster that first arises from just incompetent Soviet policies due to the fact that collectivization doesn't actually work. basically communism doesn't work because when you try to collectivize the farms, it just destroys people's incentives, and you also run into things like the knowledge problem and as well as central planning. It just basically doesn't work. It's a bad economic system. It doesn't actually do what they thought it would do. That was, in a way, you can kind of forgive them because back in the day they had yet to do such a massive communist experiment, and that was just the first time that it was ever done at mass scale. Nowadays we can look back on it and see, okay, yeah, this system fails because what people actually do is they go against the collective because people are individuals. Collectives don't actually exist. It's just a nonsensical system. It doesn't actually work because people don't have just magic collective knowledge. People are individuals. Humans are 90 to 110 IQ monkeys. We are not 300 IQ omnibenevolent angels, omniscient people who just know everything and understand the subjective needs of every member in our community. We don't have that kind of psychic mind reading powers to know that. We need to actually use prices to be able to calculate the value of what these foods of grain are. So that's the first problem, is that communism just doesn't work. And so, of course, there was a famine as a result of their bad policies. And from that, of course, now you have a famine going on. Then Stalin just kind of blamed Ukraine to some degree. And so that's where the genocide comes in, is that you could almost call the thing that was done against Ukraine as a opportunistic genocide, where, okay, this isn't going very well, but hey, Ukrainian nationalism, so let's use this as an opportunity to screw Ukraine over. And so there's a few things that he passed that were specifically targeted to screw Ukraine over, mainly just more aggressive blacklisting and locking their borders down. So now if they're starving to death, they can't flee. And that's kind of the smoking gun, I would say, is the fact that the borders in Ukraine were locked down where other ethnicities, because there was famine all across the Soviet Union, because again, communism doesn't work. So there were other countries where that also had a lot of deaths going on as a result of the famine and starvation and whatnot, which was also horrible. But where the smoking gun comes in, that it was Ukraine, is why did they specifically lock Ukrainian borders down? Why did they actually blacklist, I believe it was around 37 to 39 districts in Ukraine, to the point where they just weren't allowed to trade food at all? And they specifically did that, targeting Ukrainians. And Holodomor deniers, they don't really have a good answer for that, or what they'll do instead. For instance, one of my responses to my Holodomor video came from Bad Panda, also known as Bad Empanada, but Bad Panda is more fun to say, so I say Bad Panda. Is he just kind of brought out the Mark Tauger defense, and Mark Tauger is a scholar, and he's the one that you're going to see cited the most among tanky groups. If you search for things like, you go to, say, Reddit, because commies love to be on Reddit, and you search for Red Famine and say r/communism, what you're going to immediately run into is this little review of Red Famine by Mark Tauger, where he allegedly debunks Red Famine. He doesn't. He completely fails to debunk it, and his reasoning is terrible. That's actually what's going to be my next major rant, is I'm going to be kind of going into that review and explaining why Mark Tauger is pretty much a stereotypical pedant. He just nitpicks at things. He doesn't actually ever refute the central point. And Mark Tauger, what he will kind of do is he'll just point out to random inconsistencies that don't really matter. He doesn't actually refute anything that people are saying about the Holodomor. Like, for instance, when confronted with Ukrainian borders being shut down, Mark Tauger would be like, "Oh well, only about 200,000 people were actually caught at the border, and that doesn't match up with the 4 million figure, so therefore it doesn't actually matter." And that's, of course, brain rot reasoning. That's completely brain rot reasoning, because that's not counting the number of people who would try to flee if the border wasn't there. Just because 200,000 or so were actually caught, that doesn't actually tell you who just simply stayed in their village and didn't even attempt to cross the border because they didn't even want to risk it for the biscuit. And Tower just kind of completely ignores that kind of qualitative analysis, because you can't actually measure empirically how many people would want to flee if they could flee. And so what a lot of kind of the people like Tauger do, I would call them strict empiricists, people who only rely on empirical data and just don't rely on rationality at all. They just don't use logic, period. They just don't even think about things using reason. They just like, oh, I can't quantitatively measure this, therefore it doesn't exist. Brain rot, absolute brain rot. It's a cancer on academics that some people think like this, and Tauger is a perfect example of this kind of midwittery.
As far as these sources go, I can't believe I'm really about to say this, but there's a whole load of more where that came from. And, and
yeah, on sources, the funny thing is, I mean, it actually is the academic consensus that Holodomor was a genocide. And so another thing that tankies will lie about is they'll try to say that, oh, Mark Tauger is the centermost, most prestigious authority on Soviet history and the famine, and so you should only listen to him when it comes to the Holodomor, and you should ignore all these other academics who say that actually was a genocide. In reality, he's a joke. Tauger's a joke.
Yes.
I'm going to be basically, I have already done pretty much half of my Holodomor video follow-up. It's going to be a long one, and I've already finished the point where I'm basically just ripping Tauger apart. His work is terrible. I'm sorry, Tauger, if you're listening to this, but your life's work is trash.
As far as, these Holodomor deniers, a lot of them do tend to argue that it wasn't a genocide because Stalin didn't set out to do what he did on purpose. And there are some who deny that Stalin was the cause of the famine altogether. So basically, what I'm kind of curious about here then is, how do Holodomor deniers defend their case? And how do you in turn counter a lot of these arguments?
I mean, you want me to just put it to you simple?
Sure.
They lie. That's pretty much where it goes. What they'll do is they'll just take some kind of data out of context, or they'll do what Tauger does and nitpick at something while just completely ignoring the overall context and overall all the data and what it actually means, and they'll just lie. Or a really common one that they'll do is they'll demand that you provide them with a primary source when you're quoting a historian that says that the Holodomor is a genocide, and they'll demand the primary source behind what that historian is saying. And of course, what they're really doing when they say that, when they say source on that, is they're actually making a form of Gish Gallop. Because historians, what they do is they compile data from the hundreds of thousands of archives, and they put it into just one sort of concise narrative of what it means. Because when history, the annoying thing about history is it's not really an exact science. It's all just kind of based on hard evidence, and what actually being an academic historian and going through things involves going through dozens and dozens and dozens of paperwork from a long time ago, and most of it is going to be effectively really, really boring. I guess that's a way to put it. You're going to be going through papers that most of them don't really say much. They're various archives of, say, what this person did on July 5th, 1951. And it's just going to be this person did their duties for the day, and that was it. And there'll be some various clerical things that they did, and that's all. And you have hundreds of thousands of papers that say things like that basically don't really tell you anything. And historians, what they'll do is they'll just try to find the ones that actually they'll piece together many, many primary sources to actually get a picture of what happened. And so when a tanky asks you to give them only primary sources, what they're really doing is they're saying that you need to now do the same work that a historian did, which can take months and months of your time to actually do. And they know that you can't actually do that. They know that that's an unrealistic thing to ask for, but they ask for it anyway because to a casual onlooker in the context of a debate, they're just going to assume that because you don't have an immediate answer for them on that, and that makes you wrong. But of course, in the context of, say, a live debate on the Holodomor, you've only got maybe, in live debates, you got maybe 30 seconds to a minute to answer. So of course you're not going to be able to do something that requires months upon months of work to do and give the tanky what they're asking. And they know that, and that's a form of them lying, because what they're actually doing, of course, is that they're taking their sources out of context. And they're just lying.
It's very disingenuous. And to begin with, I do find the counter argument that Stalin was simply unaware, that his actions were killing people to be weak, even if it was true, which, as the hard documentation does prove, it is not true.
Yeah, there were letters with Stalin that were revealed in the archives. Stalin knew it was going on. We know that Stalin knew it was going on. That's another actual dishonest argument that tankies will do, is that this is something that Bad Panda actually made, is the little argument that, oh, well, when the Soviet archives were open in 1990, then this was all debunked. It was all debunked, and the reason that we still accept that the Holodomor was a genocide is because of the evil capitalist regime of the evil West and whatnot. But no, the truth is that the Soviet archives actually confirmed that it was a genocide. What the Soviet archives opening up actually did is, all it proved was that the famine from the get-go, when it was initially being planned, was not actually planned from original to be a genocide against their own people. They did sincerely believe at first, when they were actually drawing up their farm collectivization scheme, they did believe at first that it was actually going to work. And the funny thing is, that's, if anything, even worse for them, because it shows that the communists not only did a genocide, but they also don't know what they're doing, and their system doesn't work. So it's not actually the W that they think it is. It's actually a massive L. And so, of course, people who say that it's a genocide now are more talking about that it was an opportunistic genocide, that it was intentionally used as a weapon against Ukraine to crush Ukrainian nationalism. But nobody actually thinks that the original plan of collectivization, as it was drawn up before things even got started, was it going to be a genocide. It was just that, oh, well, this is going on, so let's lock Ukrainians down and blame them and blame the Kulaks. And another thing on the Soviet archives is, of course, that the letters from Stalin revealed that he did know what was going on. So again, that's kind of where the sort of tanky argument that I made fun of them is that they inevitably at some point will say something that logically requires them to say the same thing as, well, you can't prove that Stalin knew that locking down and stealing food from starving people would kill them, therefore it wasn't a genocide. Because that's, of course, ridiculous, but that's effectively what they're saying when they deny the Holodomor, because we have evidence that Stalin did know those things, and yet he did that to Ukrainians anyway. So did you just not know that locking someone in a box and refusing to give them food would kill them? That's pretty much it. It's an insane argument to even make. It's crazy denial. In some ways, it's even dumber than Holocaust denial, because Holocaust denial is very wrong. It's very incorrect. The Holocaust definitely happened as well, but at least with them, some of their arguments might seem correct at first, like, oh, wooden doors on gas chambers. That doesn't make sense. Of course, they're lying, but at least it's an argument that might logically make sense until you realize that the Nutsi is lying to you. But with Holodomor denial, it's just wrong on a rational level. It just doesn't even make sense.
I'm glad you pointed out as well the absurd hair splitting behind the argument that starvation cannot count as genocide because it's some kind of natural process. It's not directly, put on somebody by somebody else. I think it's a completely pointless distinction to try making, and I think it's a bit insulting to the Ukrainians as well. I mean, because after all, the implicit argument that's being made here is that the Ukrainians are responsible for their own death in that case, since it's supposedly not the state, directly engineering the situation. It's not the state's fault. I mean,
Except for the 1,100 brigaders that Stalin hired to steal food from Ukrainians.
Exactly. Yes. I mean, the truth of the matter is the Holodomor was not the Ukrainians going on a hunger strike. I mean, This was a situation that they were, thrust into involuntarily, and another party, in this case Stalin's government, voluntarily thrust them into that situation. And there is also the theory surrounding, the Kulaks, for example, as being the people, driving this particular famine. And I'm curious what type of rebuttal you offer to this particular theory.
I mean, the fact is there's just no real good evidence for it. It's effectively a weird, tanky conspiracy based on old Soviet propaganda. A lot of Soviet propaganda was based on class war, similarly to how far left socialist thinkers today use a racial and cultural divide. Back in those days, it was more of a class divide, and kulaks were really just a class of peasants who were rich enough to have their own land and hire help. And what they would do is that they would just basically blame all problems on the successful people. Kulaks were really just successful peasants, and so they were thus the scapegoat for all problems, and they would just find reasons to blame them for all problems. So when tankies use that argument, all they're really doing is repeating Soviet propaganda that you should blame everything on the successful people. And in a way, it was actually an early version of the equity fallacy. It's seeing that, oh, these people have a better outcome, therefore they must be doing something wrong or doing something evil. They must be stealing from his fellow man in order to be more successful. It couldn't possibly be that they're just more competent farmers. That couldn't be it. They can't just be more competent. They must be winning because they're cheating, because everyone's equal, therefore everyone should have equal outcomes, and anybody who doesn't have an equal outcome is either being discriminated against because they are less successful, or they must be cheating because they're more successful. It, at its core, is just bad reasoning. That's all it really is. And when you see communists repeat that, they're just going by Soviet propaganda, which is based on essentially the equity fallacy.
The kulaks being behind this event is an especially, particularly disingenuous form of Marxist propaganda. However, the counter-argument that I'm particularly confused by is the claim that the Holodomor didn't happen to begin with. This is perhaps not as prevalent as other forms of Holodomor denial, but it's still one that's pushed by certain fringe groups. So how do you push back against claims that the Holodomor didn't happen altogether? That it's a myth, which is pushed by a lot of Ukrainian nationalist groups, such as Azov.
Oh, I mean, the ones that say that it's a myth outright to the point where especially if they try to deny that the famine even happened, I mean, at that point, you're effectively getting into flat earthism, where they're just denying evidence outright. Even historians who don't believe it was a genocide, because Mark Tauger, regardless of his bad reasoning for it, he is an actual respected historian. He's pretty much the only one that takes the tanky position on it, but he is an actual respected historian. But even he will admit that the famine happened, and even he will admit that at least part of it was due to Stalin's bad policies. He just tries to say that it's primarily caused by natural causes, such as bad weather or droughts and whatnot. He'll say that that was the primary reason for the famine. But no historian at all, period, denies that the famine itself actually happened. I mean, even the Russian Soviets at the time eventually admitted it. And of course, the Russian government today admits at the very least that there was a famine. So anyone who tries to even deny outright that it happened at all, they're effectively, you can just pretty much dismiss them in the same way you dismiss someone who claims that they were kidnapped by aliens in a UFO and had a probe shoved up their butt. It's kind of that level of psychosis you're dealing with. Nobody actually believes that. The evidence is overwhelmingly against them. You almost don't even have to be confused by their argument because they're just denying reality at that point.